Have you ever looked at the person you once loved and realized they no longer see you? Richard Beckett, Langford had everything: wealth, power, prestige. But one day, he came home to silence. His wife, Eleanor, the quiet force behind his once perfect world, had vanished without a fight. No scandal, no farewell speech. Just gone. What happens when a man trades love for ambition, only to find himself locked out of the one room he can't buy his way into? This isn't a story of betrayal. It's a story of reckoning, of what remains after the lights fade, and all that's left is the truth. If you had to choose between being seen by the world or being understood by one person, what would you pick? And if that person walked away, not out of anger, but out of quiet heartbreak, would you chase them, or finally face yourself? This is the story of a man who thought he had it all until he saw her. In the VIP section, he couldn't enter. Take a deep breath, let the questions linger. Then walk with us through a story of lost love, rediscovered purpose, and the silent power of choosing yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because some stories aren't just told, they're felt. Richard Beckett Langford stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, tailored to perfection. His tuxedo deep navy with satin lapels hugged his frame like it was sculpted for this very night. Mallory Rose Knight, draped over his arm in a champagne-colored gown, glittered under the crystal lights of the Sterling Hotel's entrance. Photographers leaned in. Paparazzi lights flickered. Mallory smiled effortlessly. Richard lifted his chin. He knew the cameras would love them. This was their moment. Until it wasn't. "Name, sir," the security guard asked, clipboard steady in hand. "Richard Langford. +1. Richard replied smoothly, the confidence in his voice like a practiced handshake. The guard scanned the list once, then again. His brow creased. "I'm sorry, sir." "Your name's not on the approved list." Richard blinked. "That can't be right. I've sponsored this event for years." "I understand," the guard said, polite but firm. "But this year's gala is invitation only. No exceptions." Mallory's glossy lips parted. "You must be kidding." She laughed, though it came out nervous. "This is Richard Langford. I know who he is," the guard replied quietly. And that's when Richard saw her, through the glass walls above, on the second-floor balcony. Eleanor Hart Langford stood in a gown the color of midnight. Her silver blonde hair was swept to the side, her posture straight, serene. She wasn't just attending, she was hosting. For a moment, Richard didn't breathe. The security lights shimmered against her skin like moonlight. She stood surrounded by senators, business leaders, people Richard once called allies. But no one was looking at them. They were looking at her, and she didn't look back. Just one measured glance in his direction. No wave, no smile. Then she turned away, her silhouette moving toward the main hall like a closing curtain. "Richard," Mallory hissed, tugging on his sleeve. "Do something." But he couldn't move, couldn't think. The velvet rope in front of him felt heavier than it should. Behind them, guests arrived in waves. Some glanced their way, others whispered, but no one stopped. It was the kind of moment that, once captured, doesn't let go. A single camera flash went off click, and Richard knew, somewhere, someone would turn it into a headline. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," the guard said again, voice unchanged. This time, Richard did. He stepped back without argument, his shoes echoing against the marble floor. Mallory swore under her breath, heels clicking angrily as she turned away from the entrance. The Blacktown car returned without being called. The driver said nothing, just opened the door. Richard slid in silently. Inside the car, the air felt colder. Mallory crossed her arms, scrolling through her phone with quick, frustrated taps. Richard stared straight ahead. Above them, the gala was in full bloom. Music, laughter, light. A room that once welcomed him. Now, it barely remembered he existed. As they drove away, he caught one final glimpse of Eleanor through the glass, laughing genuinely with someone he didn't recognize, confident, effortless, in control. That was the moment it began. Or rather, the moment he realized it had already begun, 6 hours before the gala. Richard Beckett Langford had stood before a mirror taller than any man needed in the master suite of his penthouse overlooking Manhattan. The city looked like it belonged to him. From 40 stories up, everything sparkled: cars, lights, people, like a stage setting for the man who once held the script. His suit, hand-stitched in Milan, fit without a crease. His watch, a vintage Patek, gleamed with the kind of understatement only old money could afford. And Richard believed, or tried to believe, that tonight would be like all the nights before, where he walked into a room and made it his. But even as he adjusted his cufflinks, he noticed something different. A twitch at the edge of his reflection, not in his face, but behind the eyes. The man in the mirror looked the part, yes, but something beneath the surface didn't quite match. Reddy Mallory called from the living room, her voice light, clipped, distracted. She was still choosing between earrings. Richard gave a half smile, the same one he'd used for decades to silence doubt. Almost. But as he smoothed his jacket and took a last look in the mirror, something echoed in the silence, the unmistakable weight of pretending. Because the truth was, Richard hadn't felt like himself in months, maybe longer. He used to be the man who closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast, the man who knew everyone worth knowing in 3 time zones. The man whose calendar was color-coded not just with meetings, but with impact. Now there were meetings, sure. But something was missing. A pulse, a purpose. It had started small. A client who didn't return a call. A developer who pivoted to a greener partner. A magazine profile that never got published. At first, Richard told himself it was noise. Fluctuations. The market. The season. But deep down, he knew better. He'd built his empire on presence-commanding rooms, winning attention, making things happen. But lately, the rooms didn't respond the same way. The attention flickered, and things weren't happening the way they used to. Sometimes, in quiet moments. He wondered if he had aged out of relevance. He never said it out loud, not even to Mallory, especially not to Mallory. Because Mallory needed the illusion. She lived on it, on the idea that she was beside a man who still mattered, that every step they took was towards something bigger, brighter. But Richard knew how these things worked. When the shine dimmed, people looked for other light. So he kept showing up, kept performing, kept dressing the part. He convinced himself that if he just played the role well enough, the man he used to be would come back. What he didn't realize until it was too late was that the man he used to be had been unraveling for a while. It started the day Eleanor stopped waiting up for him. He came home late one night, past midnight, after a networking dinner that ended at a bar with younger executives and louder music. Eleanor wasn't in bed. She wasn't in the kitchen. She was in the study, surrounded by open folders, reviewing grant applications for a housing initiative she'd been helping with. She looked up when he walked in, but said nothing. Just a quiet, measured nod. "You're up late," he said, setting down his keys. "So are you," she replied, her tone unreadable. He shrugged it off then. Thought it was just another evening. But it wasn't. It was the first of many silences that began to stack between them. Not loud, not violent. Just thick, like fog between skyscrapers. They stopped talking at dinner. They started sleeping at different times. And eventually, Richard stopped noticing when Eleanor didn't ask where he was going anymore. She had always been composed, graceful, a partner in every way that mattered. But at some point, she stopped holding space for him, and he didn't realize it until the space was gone. He didn't leave her all at once. It was in steps, little ones. A weekend trip without mention, a text message unanswered, a dinner skipped, then, eventually, a decision framed like a formality. "It's better this way," he'd said, trying to make it sound mutual. Eleanor had simply nodded. He expected resistance, or at least sadness. Instead, she packed with quiet precision and moved out with the dignity of someone who refused to make pain theatrical. At the time, he called it strength. Now he wasn't so sure. Now, sitting in the back of the black car, watching the city flicker past, he saw that night in his mind again. Her silence, her calm, the way she didn't chase, didn't plead, didn't argue. It wasn't passivity. It was distance. And now he was starting to feel it, too. The kind of distance you can't fill with champagne or spotlights or gala invitations. The kind that stays. The morning Eleanor Hart Langford left the Harborview penthouse, she didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She didn't even look back. Instead, she closed the last box with a gentle press of her fingers, walked to the front entrance, and whispered to the space that once held their lives, "Thank you for what it was." Then she left. No grand gestures, no goodbye speeches, just a quiet exit, the kind that only those who've made peace with pain can manage. Her new apartment sat on the east side, 3 floors above a small corner bookstore and across from a community garden she used to visit years ago. It had 2 bedrooms, sun-washed wooden floors, and a balcony just wide enough for 1 chair and a potted lavender plant. It didn't overlook Central Park or the skyline, but it overlooked her own beginning. She didn't take much. A few books she loved, her late mother's upright piano, a battered journal, some art pieces that never matched Richard's marble walls. The rest she left behind, not out of spite, but because she no longer wanted to carry things that didn't feel like hers anymore. In the first few days, the silence was almost unbearable. She could hear everything, the creak of the heater, the buzz of the street below, her own breath in the early morning hours. But she didn't fill the space with noise, no TV blaring in the background, no music drowning her thoughts, just herself. She made tea in the mornings, the same way her grandmother used to. Earl Grey with a slice of lemon and a spoonful of honey. She opened the windows, even when it was cold, just to let the real world in. And slowly, something shifted. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the start of something softer, something alive. Eleanor began volunteering again. At first, it was just a few hours a week at a shelter she'd supported years ago before the endless fundraisers and gala speeches. She helped organize clothing drives, sorted donation boxes, listened to teenage girls share stories no one else had time for. They didn't know her last name. They didn't care what she used to be. And for the first time in years, she felt seen not for what she had, but for who she chose to be. She didn't talk about Richard, not to the volunteers, not to her colleagues, not even to herself. But sometimes, late at night, she would open a drawer where she kept a letter she never sent. A letter she'd written on a stormy Thursday in the tiny living room of her new apartment while the world outside roared with thunder and everything inside her threatened to collapse. She'd started the letter with no greeting, no dear Richard, just a line that cut to the truth. "You'll never understand what it cost me to stay silent." Each word was carved in ink, as though it needed to leave a mark not on paper, but on memory. She had written about the dinners, where she sat alone across from his phone. The nights he came home, hours late, smelling like cologne that wasn't hers. The moments she'd bit her tongue so tightly it almost bled, just to keep peace. But it wasn't bitterness that filled the pages. It was grief, quiet grief, the kind you carry like a stone in your chest, not because you can't let go, but because you never got the chance to speak. She kept the letter because it reminded her that her voice still existed, that she hadn't disappeared, that she had chosen silence, but not forever, and that choice became her compass. She stopped attending events where she was only Richard's wife. She turned down invitations she used to accept out of obligation. She stepped out of the shadow, one quiet, deliberate decision at a time. And as the months passed, people began to notice, not in headlines or photo spreads, but in boardrooms, in late-night Zoom calls, in coffee shop conversations about urban housing, women's safety, education access. They began to ask her what she thought, not because she spoke loudly, but because when she did speak, it meant something. She didn't have the flash, but she had the foundation. And from that, she started to build a new initiative, a new board, a new mission that didn't seek applause, only impact. She called it the Horizon Initiative, because that's what it felt like, walking towards something distant, but wide open. She didn't put her name on the press release. She declined interviews. She let the work speak first. And it did. At a city council meeting, Someone described the foundation's anonymous benefactor as the quiet force behind the change. Eleanor read the headline, then folded the paper and smiled. Not because she wanted recognition, but because, finally, her silence had turned into something powerful. Before the letter, before the penthouse was emptied, before the silence between them became unbearable. There were cracks, small at first, barely noticeable to anyone outside their circle. Even to themselves, they looked like routine, like the natural evolution of two people building a life with too many responsibilities and not enough time. But cracks always start that way, quiet, patient, hidden beneath the surface. The first came on a Thursday. Richard was late for dinner. Not the kind of late that comes with an apologetic kiss or a hurried phone call. The kind of late that's intentional, that assumes the other person will understand or won't say anything at all. Eleanor sat at the dining table, the salmon going cold, her glass of wine untouched. The candle flickered low, casting shadows on a meal that would never be eaten together. When he walked through the door past 10 p.m., he was laughing into his phone. Something about a contract closing, a potential investor, an impromptu drink with the guys. He didn't notice the table, or the quiet, or her. He just tossed his jacket on a chair and poured himself a drink like the night hadn't waited for him. She didn't say a word, and that was the beginning. After that, dinners became optional, conversations shortened. Their mornings grew quiet, not comfortably, but deliberately. Eleanor would wake before sunrise, go for walks, sip her tea on the balcony without waking him. Richard began taking earlier meetings, leaving notes instead of goodbyes. They became experts at avoiding each other without ever leaving the same space. Sometimes, Eleanor would study his face when he wasn't looking, at charity events, across long dining tables, or in reflections of glass elevators. She saw the fatigue, the restlessness, the hunger for something more or something else. But he never met her eyes anymore, not like he used to. There had been a time years before when Richard couldn't stop looking at her, when her opinions mattered more than press coverage, when he'd call just to hear her voice between meetings, when her hand in his felt like gravity, not obligation. Now, they barely touched. One evening, at a black tie fundraiser, Eleanor reached for his arm as they stepped onto the red carpet. A photographer raised a camera, waiting. Richard flinched ever so slightly, then smiled at the lens, repositioning his stance without her hand. The photo that appeared the next morning showed them standing together but apart, perfectly composed, impeccably dressed, but empty in the eyes. Eleanor clipped the article and filed it in a drawer, not to keep, just to remember what denial looked like in print. And then came the lies, not loud or cruel, just convenient. I'll be in Boston overnight, client meeting. Late dinner, don't wait up. It's just business. Eleanor never asked. Not because she didn't care, but because she already knew the answers would be rehearsed. Instead, she turned inward. She began painting again, not for galleries or display, but for herself. Soft strokes of light over canvas, scenes of quiet water, broken skies, empty roads, places where people leave and don't return, but the world still turns. She found peace in small moments, morning sunlight on her window, the smell of lavender hand soap, the clink of teacups in the cabinet, the rhythm of steps on hardwood as she paced through thoughts too heavy for words. Richard never noticed. He stopped asking where she'd been, or what she was reading, or what she was building quietly behind the scenes. She attended board meetings without his knowledge, reconnected with grassroots organizations she'd once supported in college. She even sat down with a former senator about housing reform, her notepad filled with ideas, questions, strategy. Richard still saw her name in articles sometimes, mentioned in passing as a philanthropic force behind key initiatives, but he never asked her about them, never wondered how they came to be. He assumed, as always, that Eleanor simply liked to help. What he didn't know was that she was planning a world he wouldn't be part of. And when the final crack came, it was so soft it barely made a sound. He walked into the study late one night, loosened tie, scotch in hand. Eleanor looked up from her notes, her pen pausing mid-sentence. "You're always working these days," he said, trying to smile. "So are you," she replied gently. He raised an eyebrow. You miss us at all? Eleanor closed her notebook. I miss the version of us that used to talk. The room went quiet. Richard laughed, half-hearted, defensive. That's rich coming from you. You've become a monk. She looked at him fully then, and for the first time in months, her voice held something firm. And you've turned our marriage into a mirror for your ego. He didn't respond. She didn't press. There was no shouting, no breakdown, just truth. And truth, when spoken softly, sometimes lands louder than rage ever could. That night, they slept in separate rooms. Neither of them would say it out loud yet, but something had ended. Not with a crash, with a closing. Mallory Rose Knight entered Richard's life like a burst of neon in a room designed for candlelight. She was 29, tall, magnetic, with eyes that always looked like they knew more than they let on. A former swimsuit model turned social media entrepreneur, she lived in bold colors and glossy filters. Every moment with her felt curated, like it was meant for a feed, a reel, a stage, and for a while, Richard loved that about her. She was everything Eleanor wasn't. Where Eleanor moved with restraint, Mallory moved with flash. Where Eleanor asked thoughtful questions, Mallory tossed clever punchlines. Where Eleanor lingered in shadows and chose silence when words weren't needed, Mallory filled space with sound, selfies, stories. She makes me feel young, Richard once told a colleague, as if youth could be borrowed like cologne. But beneath the charm and whirlwind energy, there was something hollow, something Richard only started noticing after the thrill wore thin. It began with little things. Mallory rearranged the penthouse, not dramatically, but enough. The grand piano Eleanor once played sat under a dust cover now, replaced by a ring light and tripods. Framed black and white art gave way to neon canvases. The living room, once quiet and dignified, became a backdrop for live streams and product unboxings. One morning, Richard walked in to find her filming a skincare routine video in his kitchen. I'm building a brand, she chirped, lips glossed to perfection. You get it. Right. Richard nodded, though he didn't. Not really. He understood influence. Yes, but not this version. Not the version that measured impact by likes and story views. Not the version that needed applause to feel real. Still. He smiled, played along. Because admitting the disconnect would be admitting something worse, that maybe he didn't belong in this new world either. They traveled together, spoke at tech panels, attended gala events where Mallory turned heads, and Richard tried to look like he wasn't just someone else's plus one in his own life. But the cracks came here too. At a charity brunch, Mallory made a joke off the cuff, poorly timed about flipping distressed properties like shoes. The room fell silent. No one laughed. Richard smiled too tightly. The host changed the subject without meeting their eyes. Later, a group photo from the event surfaced online. Everyone at their table was tagged except them. Richard said nothing. Back at the penthouse, Mallory brushed it off. People are so sensitive these days. She shrugged, pouring herself a glass of wine. You'd think they'd get a sense of humor. But Richard wasn't laughing. That night, he watched her scroll through tagged photos of herself, half listening as she dissected every angle, every caption. Do I look washed out in this one? Should I DM the editor? This lighting is awful. Why did they crop my arm like that? She didn't notice he hadn't answered in over 15 minutes. She didn't notice he wasn't in the photo she was obsessing over. She didn't notice the silence growing between them. Later, when she fell asleep on the velvet couch, TV still glowing, phone clutched in hand, Richard stood at the window, looking out over Manhattan. From up here, the city still shimmered, but something about it felt unfamiliar now, like a skyline you used to call home, but couldn't quite navigate anymore. He touched the glass, not knowing why, and in that moment, a strange ache settled in his chest, not for Mallory, but for something he couldn't name. It came back again during another party, this time at a rooftop lounge in Soho. Mallory wore a sheer metallic dress, laughed too loudly, and danced with influencers he couldn't keep track of. She waved at Richard from across the room like he was a guest, not a partner. He watched her for a long moment, the music too loud, the laughter too sharp, and then he left. He didn't tell her, just walked out and down the fire escape, rode home in a cab, alone, sat in the dark penthouse and realized something terrifying. He missed Eleanor. Not the Eleanor who sat beside him at board dinners, not the Eleanor who smiled for photographers, but the Eleanor who brought silence that felt like warmth. The Eleanor who looked at him like she still believed in who he could be. Not the man who performed, but the one who listened, who asked questions, who tried. And now, in this echoing high-rise filled with things but not presence, he felt the full weight of what he'd traded, not just a person, but a version of himself he could never reclaim. The morning Eleanor Hart Langford left, the city was still asleep, no horns blaring, no hurried footsteps, just the soft hum of a world not yet awake. She moved through the penthouse like a shadow, light on her feet, deliberate in her pace. The boxes were stacked by the door, 27 in total, 5 suitcases, a worn leather duffel holding notebooks, letters, and a photo album she hadn't opened in years. She paused by the piano, running her fingers once across the keys. No sound followed. The lid stayed closed. There was no final glance at the bedroom, no last cup of coffee in the kitchen. She had said her goodbyes in the spaces long ago, when their silence started echoing louder than their words. The only thing she left on the kitchen counter was a note, not for Richard, for the cleaning crew. Please handle the piano with care. It's sentimental. She didn't leave a message for him. No explanations, no postscript emotions, because if he hadn't heard her by now, nothing written would reach him. When she stepped outside, the doorman offered a polite nod. He didn't ask where she was going, just opened the car door and said, "All the best, Mrs. Langford." She didn't correct him, but inside, she'd already let the name go. By the time Richard returned that evening, the penthouse looked almost untouched, only the piano and a few frames missing. But something in the air had changed. It was colder, cleaner, hollow. He stood in the entryway for a long time, not quite ready to admit that she was truly gone. Not temporarily. Not on vacation. Gone. He didn't call her. He didn't text. He told himself she needed space, but deep down, he wasn't sure she'd left any door open for him to walk through again. Across town, Eleanor stood in her new apartment, surrounded by unopened boxes and silence. But this silence didn't hurt, not like before. It was hers now. That first night, she didn't unpack. She lit a candle, boiled water, poured tea into her favorite chip mug. Then she curled into a chair by the window and simply sat watching the lights blink across distant apartment windows, each one holding a story she didn't know, each one a reminder the world moved on, gently, even when hearts didn't. Sleep didn't come easy that night. It never did, not after big endings. But she didn't cry. Instead, she opened a notebook, dated the corner of a fresh page, and wrote just one line. "This isn't the end of us, it's the beginning of me." The next morning, she unpacked slowly, not out of reluctance, but reverence. Each object told a story, one she chose to carry, not because it was easy, but because it was hers. A candle from a shop in Maine, bought during a stormy vacation. A clay bowl shaped by a teenage girl at a shelter Eleanor once funded. A scarf her mother had given her, still faintly scented with lavender. She hung a single painting above the couch, one she'd painted herself years ago, when her hands still remembered how to hold peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's days took shape like a gentle rhythm. Morning tea, long walks, quiet visits to the local community center, volunteering where help was needed but rarely praised, meetings over chipped tables instead of mahogany desks, conversations with women who didn't need a title to feel worthy. She wore sneakers more than heels now. Carried a canvas tote instead of a designer handbag, and no one called her Mrs. Langford anymore, just Eleanor. And that, finally, was enough. She didn't stalk Richard's name online, didn't ask about Mallory, didn't read the gossip blogs when they began whispering about Richard's new flame. She had no space for noise. She was listening for something else. One afternoon, she found herself in a cafe downtown, sketching in a small notebook. Across from her sat an older woman named Celeste, a retired city planner who'd once helped restructure public parks across New York. "You're not loud," Celeste observed, stirring her tea, "but you hold space like someone who's been quiet for a long time and finally knows why." Eleanor smiled. "Maybe because I used to confuse silence with surrender, and now I know it can be a strategy." Celeste nodded, eyes kind, smart woman. Later that night, Eleanor opened the notebook again, flipped past pages of lists and ideas until she landed on a letter she hadn't touched in weeks, the one she never sent. She read it in full for the first time, without flinching. The hurt was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She folded it back into the spine and whispered softly, "Not yet," because the time would come to let it go. But not tonight. Tonight. She wasn't mourning a marriage. She was learning how to live again without waiting for someone else to notice she'd been there all along. Richard Beckett Langford was winning on paper. The commercial deal he'd been chasing for months had finally closed. A 68-story tower in Midtown, already dubbed the Langford Crown, was set to be the tallest mixed-use luxury project in Manhattan. His face was on magazine covers again. Comeback king, they called him. Investors lined up. Emails flooded in. His calendar filled with power lunches, strategy calls, rooftop interviews. The world had returned its gaze to Richard Langford, but not its warmth. The congratulations felt cold. The parties felt staged, and the champagne no longer tasted like victory. It tasted like routine. His team celebrated in a glass-walled boardroom high above Fifth Avenue. Mallory clinked flutes with executives, posed for photos in a backless dress, laughed just a little too loudly. Richard stood near the window, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. Outside, the city moved like it always did, fast, distracted, indifferent. Behind him, someone said, to Langford back on top. Richard turned and raised his glass, smiled on cue, nodded when expected. But the sound that filled the room didn't reach him. It was all just noise now. At home, things weren't better. Mallory was still Mallory, effervescent, unpredictable, restless. But her energy had turned from intoxicating to exhausting. Their conversations had grown thin, stitched together with trends, hashtags, pop culture, and the occasional complaint about bad lighting at brunch. One evening, after a long day, Richard returned to the penthouse to find her filming a dance video in the foyer. "Do you mind?" she asked, annoyed. "You walked into the shot." "I live here," he replied, more surprised than angry. She sighed, rolled her eyes, and went back to filming. Richard retreated to the study, shut the door, and sat in the dark for a long time. He didn't know when exactly the loneliness had crept in, but now it lived in every corner. It sat beside him at breakfast. It watched him work. It followed him through crowds and empty rooms alike, and it spoke loudest in the quietest moments, especially at night. One night, unable to sleep, Richard poured himself a drink and pulled out an old leather box from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were forgotten things, cufflinks Eleanor had gifted him, a folded playbill from their anniversary at the Met, and a tiny envelope labeled in Eleanor's handwriting for when you forget why you started. He never opened it. He still didn't. He just stared at it, fingertips brushing the edge. He didn't cry. Richard Langford didn't cry. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to grief, not just for Eleanor, but for the version of himself that had once dreamed with her. At the next board meeting, one of his advisors suggested a rebrand. Make it more current. Richard. Younger. Lean into the edge. He nodded automatically. But later, alone in the elevator, he looked at his reflection and didn't recognize the man looking back. That man looked tired, and tired wasn't part of the Langford brand. He tried to shake it off, booked a weekend in Miami with Mallory, filled the itinerary with yacht dinners and rooftop events. But halfway through the trip, while Mallory posed for drone footage, Richard sat under an umbrella by the pool, scrolling through a news article someone had forwarded him. It was about a rising nonprofit initiative in New York City, one that had just partnered with 3 city agencies to develop transitional housing for women and children. It was being called the Quiet Revolution in Urban Compassion. No names were mentioned, no photos, just a quote from an unnamed founder. We don't need recognition. We need results. Real change doesn't need a spotlight. It needs commitment. Richard knew the voice. He closed the article, heart beating just a little faster. Mallory called out from across the deck. Did you see my post? It already hit 100K views. He looked up, smiled faintly, and nodded. Then he turned his phone face down. That night, he didn't go to the rooftop dinner. He stayed in the hotel room, watching old city council hearings on his laptop. Searching for Eleanor's name between the lines, reading between words, looking for her in policies, proposals, footnotes. He didn't know what he wanted. An apology. A second chance, or just proof that she hadn't disappeared, only moved beyond him. And the truth sank in, slow and painful. She hadn't left to punish him. She had left to find herself. And in doing so, she'd found something he'd long forgotten how to build: purpose. Real, unglamorous, inconvenient purpose. The kind that doesn't win you headlines, but wins you peace. Richard turned off the laptop. Then he stared at the ceiling for a long time, feeling the full weight of being a man who had it all and had no idea what to do with it anymore. Eleanor Hart never returned with fanfare. No glossy interviews, no talk show confessions, no social media declarations. Her name didn't trend. Her face wasn't splashed across magazines. And yet, people started whispering it in the circles where decisions were made and lives were shaped. It began with a single policy. A pilot program proposed to the city council designed to reallocate underused municipal buildings into temporary housing for women escaping domestic abuse. The paperwork was clean. The financials were airtight. The research thorough. There was no flashy signature at the end. Just the initials E.H. Some recognized them. Most didn't. But the council voted unanimously in favor because it wasn't the author they were drawn to. It was the clarity, the quiet boldness, the sense that whoever wrote it cared more about outcomes than applause. Behind the scenes, Eleanor met with policymakers in modest offices, over coffee and paper cups, sometimes in public libraries when schedules didn't align. She carried a leather notebook, wore simple blazers, and rarely spoke in long sentences. But when she did speak, people listened, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. In the months that followed, the Horizon Initiative expanded. More partnerships, more projects, more whispered acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, was connecting threads long left tangled. She's like gravity, one councilwoman said after a meeting. Not loud, but you feel her the moment she enters the room. Meanwhile, articles began appearing in niche journals, academic publications, and community newsletters. Pieces that spoke of transformation without naming the transformer. Success stories tied to anonymous benefactors, structural shifts led by unlisted directors. But the people who needed to know knew. Eleanor didn't hide. She just didn't center herself, and that made her even more visible to those who paid attention. It wasn't long before invitations started arriving. First, from small panels on urban reform, then larger ones, national forums, philanthropic roundtables, think tanks. She declined most of them, not out of arrogance, out of intention. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a servant. Still, there were times she knew she had to step forward. One evening, during a town hall in the Bronx, the moderator read aloud a question submitted anonymously. How do we build trust again in a world that sold so much of it to the highest bidder? The room went quiet. Eleanor leaned into the microphone. You don't start big, she said calmly. You start local. You show up when no one's watching. You follow through even when it's inconvenient. And you stay long enough to clean up after the applause ends. The room exhaled, soft and slow. It wasn't poetic. It was practical. And people believed her because she wasn't trying to be believed, she was just being real. Richard Langford read a quote from that town hall 2 weeks later in a newsletter forwarded by a former colleague. He read it twice. Then again. He didn't need to see the name to know the voice. That night, as Manhattan pulsed with its usual urgency outside his penthouse windows, Richard sat in his dark study, the city lights casting lines across his face. He didn't call her, didn't message, didn't even know what he would say if he did, but he whispered her name. Not out of hope, out of memory, out of something that sounded like reverence. Back downtown, Eleanor stood by her apartment window, cradling a mug of mint tea. The calendar on her wall was filled meetings, site visits, late-night brainstorms. But she wasn't tired. She was rooted. She was whole. Sometimes, she still thought of Richard, not with anger, not even with regret, but with a kind of distant gratitude, because in losing what she once thought she needed, she found what she never knew she had. And in walking away from someone else's story, she'd begun to write her own. One where power didn't shout. It simply stood. The Sterling Hotel gleamed under Manhattan's early evening sky, each glass panel reflecting the last gold streaks of sunset like polished pride. Inside, the annual Metropolitan Philanthropy Gala unfolded with the kind of elegance that didn't need to shout. Crystal chandeliers, live cello. Laughter softened by linen napkins and shared legacy. This year, the theme was restoring cities, restoring dignity. And in the center of it all, without stepping onto a single spotlight, stood Eleanor Hart. She moved through the room with quiet grace, speaking softly, listening intently, not a host in title, but in presence. Her name wasn't on the banners or in bold font on the brochures, but her touch was everywhere, from the selection of caterers who sourced from local shelters to the art installations made by displaced youth now thriving under her programs. People didn't crowd her, they leaned in, they offered hands, not because she was a symbol, but because they trusted her. Upstairs, on the balcony that overlooked the grand entrance, Eleanor stood briefly, watching as guests continued to arrive, and then she saw him. Richard. He stood outside, a few steps past the red carpet, his name clearly not on the list. Mallory Rose Knight beside him, visibly agitated, mouthing frustration to no one who cared to hear it. Richard wasn't angry. Not really. He was still, as if the world had finally gone quiet enough for him to hear the truth. He could see her just barely through the glass. The way the light found her, but didn't chase her. The way people turned to her, not out of habit, but respect. This was no accident. This was Eleanor's world now, and he was no longer invited. Mallory tugged on his arm. Let's go. This is ridiculous. But Richard didn't move. The security guard remained professional. Sir, I'm sorry. This event is private. Invitation only. Richard gave a soft nod. I understand. He stepped back not in defeat, but in recognition. Mallory stormed towards the car without him. He lingered, just long enough to see Eleanor glance in his direction. Their eyes met. For a moment, a single breath. Eleanor didn't smile, didn't frown. Her face held something more powerful peace, not the kind born of revenge, but of closure. Then she turned away, joining a conversation with a senator about reforming zoning laws for affordable housing. Her laugh drifted lightly across the balcony, soft as dusk. Richard exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Inside the car, Mallory typed furiously on her phone. They'll hear about this. She snapped. Richard slid in beside her, silent. He looked out the window at the hotel, its light, its quiet grandeur, its reflection of a world he'd once walked through without noticing who made it shine. Mallory kept talking. He kept watching the door. She never came back out, and he didn't expect her to. Back inside, Eleanor moved from table to table with ease. She spoke with young grant recipients, listened to teachers, laughed with artists. She didn't mention the man at the door once, because tonight wasn't about him. It was about every woman who had been told her silence was weakness, every voice that had been overlooked because it didn't echo loud enough. Every moment, Eleanor had doubted herself and still chose to show up. She glanced once more at the entrance, not expecting him, not hoping, just remembering. Then she placed her hand on her heart, took a slow breath, and turned toward the next conversation. Because the future didn't wait for ghosts. It waited for builders, and Eleanor was already building. The car ride home from the Sterling Hotel was unusually quiet. Mallory Rose Knight had given up trying to talk. Her indignation had withered under Richard's silence. She stared out the window, her reflection in the glass flickering like someone she didn't quite recognize anymore. Richard sat motionless beside her, one hand resting on his knee, the other curled loosely under his chin. His mind wasn't on the event. It wasn't even on Eleanor. It was on himself, or rather the echo of who he used to be. When they reached the penthouse, Mallory walked in first, tossed her clutch onto the velvet chaise, and slipped off her heels with practiced frustration. "I'm done," she muttered. "I don't care how rich your ex-wife is or what kind of game this is. She's not better than me." Richard didn't reply. She turned to him, arms crossed. "Did you hear me?" He nodded slowly. "I did." Mallory waited for more. A defense, a denial, anything. But Richard walked past her, straight to the study, and shut the door. He didn't slam it, just closed it gently, inside. The room felt colder than he remembered. Maybe it was the absence of Eleanor's scent, or maybe it was the mirror. He sat at the desk and stared at himself. Not in the grand mirror above the fireplace, but in the thin, vertical strip of glass on the side of his desk lamp. It was just enough to show him a sliver of his face, just enough to make him wonder when the lines around his eyes had deepened, when his hair had thinned slightly at the temples, when his jaw had lost its stubborn edge. He leaned back and closed his eyes. He thought of Eleanor's gaze from the balcony, steady, unreadable, not angry, not cold, just done. It wasn't rejection that haunted him. It was irrelevance, that she had built something magnificent without him, not to spite him, but because she no longer needed his shadow to stretch farther. He had always believed he was the center of every room, of every relationship, of every success. But now, the rooms didn't feel like his. The success didn't taste like victory. And the relationship he had with Mallory felt more like noise than connection. He picked up a photo frame from his desk. It was from 5 years ago. Him and Eleanor, at a beach house in Cape Cod. She had her hair tied up messily, sunglasses crooked, sand on her sleeves. He was laughing, mid-sentence, his hand reaching for hers. It wasn't posed, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. He set it down slowly, then reached for the small envelope Eleanor had once left in his drawer, the one labeled, "For when you forget why you started." He didn't open it. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he opened a blank page on his notepad and wrote, "What if I've never actually started at all?" He stared at the sentence. Something in him broke a little, and something else surfaced. He rose from the desk and walked barefoot into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, the hum of the fridge, the distant traffic, the silence of his own heartbeat. He was a man alone in a city of millions, and for the first time in his life, he felt it, truly, undeniably alone. Mallory had gone to bed, or maybe she'd left altogether. He didn't check. He didn't need to. Because this loneliness wasn't about her presence or absence. It was about what he'd done with his life, how much he'd built, how little of it could hold him now. He wandered into the living room. The piano was still there, though it hadn't been touched in years. Dust layered its cover like regret. Richard sat before it, lifted the lid. The keys were slightly out of tune. He pressed one, then another, and suddenly his throat tightened. He couldn't play, never could, but Eleanor had. And she used to say the piano taught her patience, that every wrong note still had a place, that every silence was part of the music. He lowered the lid and sat in the quiet. No spotlight, no power move, no audience. Just a man unraveling, thread by thread, finally ready to admit he had no idea who he'd become and no idea how to find his way back. The days after the gala passed, like fog, thick, slow, and strangely still. Richard Beckett Langford stopped attending meetings. He declined interviews, canceled dinners, ignored texts from Mallory, who eventually packed 2 suitcases and left without leaving a note. Or maybe she had. He hadn't checked. He didn't miss her. Not because she didn't matter, but because she had never really arrived. And neither had he. He began waking early, not for work, not for deals. Just to be awake. He'd sit at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring at the gray-blue light that slid slowly across his stone countertops. Sometimes he'd read, Mostly, he didn't. The quiet was new, uncomfortable, but necessary. One morning, he opened his desk drawer and looked again at the envelope. Eleanor's handwriting stared back at him, steady, elegant, undemanding. He placed it on the table, didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he searched online for the Horizon Initiative. No splash page. No personal branding, just a clean website, mission-driven, photos of volunteers, housing projects, food banks, children reading in reimagined classrooms, and in the corner, under our board, a name he hadn't seen in years. Eleanor Hart, founder, no photo, just a one-line bio believer in quiet, long-term change. Richard stared at that sentence longer than he cared to admit. It didn't sting. It humbled. The next day, he did something he hadn't done in decades. He showed up unannounced, not to Eleanor's apartment, but to a public event hosted by her foundation, a park cleanup initiative on the Lower East Side. No press, no donors, just people in jeans and gloves, hauling trash bags and planting trees. He stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed. Then he saw her, hair tied back, sleeves rolled, dirt on her knees, laughing with a child over a crooked sapling. She looked radiant, not in the way magazines captured, but in the way soil made life possible. Richard didn't step forward, didn't call her name. He just watched. For the first time, he let her exist without needing to orbit around him, and it shook him. The next morning, he wrote a letter. It wasn't long. It wasn't poetic. It read, Eleanor. I came yesterday not to be seen, just to see. I understand now that I never really saw you. Not fully, not when you stayed, not when you left. I won't ask for anything. I've asked enough of you already. But if you ever wanted to talk about the past, about anything, just say the word. I hope you're well. Richard. He didn't send it, not yet. Instead, he folded it, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it behind Eleanor's letter. 2 unsent letters, side by side. He spent the next week reading books Eleanor had once recommended, articles from urban planners, journals on social equity. He scribbled notes, asked questions, resisted the urge to have answers. Then he emailed a staff member listed on the Horizon site. Asked if volunteers were welcome for non-public projects. He signed only his initials RBL. 2 days later, he was assigned to a team. No one recognized him. And for the first time in years, he didn't introduce himself with a resume. He painted a classroom wall, sorted school supplies, carried boxes of books into a converted rec center, and it felt good, not redemptive, but real. One evening, as he helped stack donated chairs, a young woman handed him a folded flyer, open house next week. She smiled, our founders speaking. She's kind of a legend. Richard nodded. I've heard that. He didn't plan to go. He didn't want to impose. But something in him stirred. That night, he opened Eleanor's letter, the one he'd held for months. It read, Richard, if you're reading this, you've lost something. Maybe not just me, maybe yourself. I'm not writing to fix that. I'm writing to tell you it's not too late to begin again. Not for us, for you. Because beneath the noise, the power, the performance, I knew there was a man who once wanted to do more than build towers. You wanted to build a life. I hope you still do. Richard read it twice. Then he folded it gently and whispered into the dark. I'm trying. Spring arrived quietly in the city, not with fireworks, but with subtle changes, the air less bitter, the sun lingering just a little longer each evening, tulips pushing through sidewalk cracks, as if to say, we begin again. Eleanor Hart stood in the doorway of the East Side Community Center, watching children race past her into a reading room they had painted together just last month. Behind her, a team of volunteers wrapped up their last session of the day. The open house had gone well. Dozens of new partners, 3 city officials now backing their next program. And yet, Eleanor felt something quieter blooming inside her, less like pride, more like peace. She didn't expect him to come. Even after reading his letter, even after hearing from staff that someone named RBL had been volunteering weekly, she hadn't let her hopes wander too far. But then, just before sunset, She saw him. Richard Beckett Langford. He didn't arrive in a suit. No chauffeur, no entourage, just him, in jeans and a navy sweater, holding a small, cloth-bound notebook in his hand. He stood at the entrance for a moment, uncertain. Their eyes met. No drama, no orchestral music in the background. Just a soft nod, mutual, human, whole. Eleanor walked over, and for the first time in years, they stood as equals, no shadows between them, no power to prove, just two people shaped by time and truth. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Richard replied. He looked around. "It's beautiful here. It's still becoming," she said with a smile. "I see that." He nodded and then paused. "Thank you for the letter." Eleanor tilted her head. "Thank you for reading it." They sat on the bench just outside the center, beneath a blooming dogwood tree. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind carried soft laughter from the children inside. The leaves shimmered, and silence for once wasn't a distance. It was a bridge. "I was angry for a long time," Richard admitted, voice steady, "at the world, at myself, at you, even. I didn't understand what I had, not until I lost it." Eleanor looked ahead, not at him. "We were never really us." "Richard," she said gently, "not the way we told ourselves. You were building an empire. I was trying to build a home inside of it. They weren't the same thing." He nodded. "I know that now. I didn't leave to hurt you," she added. "I know," he said again. "You left to save yourself." She turned to him, soft eyes meeting his. "I left to find myself." He smiled faintly. "And you did. I'm still finding her." He reached into his pocket and handed her the notebook. "What's this?" she asked. "A new beginning, maybe?" He said, "Notes, ideas, not business, just thoughts. I've been volunteering, listening more than speaking." She flipped through a few pages. His handwriting was familiar, neat, slanted, deliberate. "I don't expect anything," he added quickly. "I just wanted you to know. I'm trying, not for you, not even for forgiveness, just because it's time I did something real." She closed the notebook gently. "I believe you." They sat in silence again, the city humming around them. Then she said, "You don't owe me anything. Richard, we both survived the storm. What matters now is what we build from the quiet." He looked at her, truly looked. "I never knew silence could be this full." Eleanor smiled. "Now you do." As the sky turned golden, a staff member waved to Eleanor from inside. She stood slowly, smoothing her coat. "I have to go," she said. He stood, too. "Of course. Will I see you again?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe, but not like before. We're different now." Richard offered a warm smile. "That's okay." They didn't hug. They didn't make promises. They simply let the moment close on its own. As Eleanor walked back inside, Richard turned toward the street, notebook in hand, heart a little lighter. He didn't leave with her, but he left with something just as sacred: understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet truth that not all storms destroy. Some cleanse, and what remains after the storm is the beginning of something honest. In the quiet unraveling of Richard and Eleanor's story lies a timeless truth. Success means little when it costs you connection. We spend much of life building careers, homes, reputations, but somewhere along the way, we forget that the most enduring foundations are built not from stone or status, but from presence, empathy, and listening. Eleanor didn't leave to punish. She left to preserve what was left of herself. And Richard's journey reminds us that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from finally seeing what was there all along. For those of us who've lived through seasons of love and loss, this story asks, when was the last time you truly sat with someone without needing to be right or admired? Sometimes, the most radical thing we can do is slow down, say less, and really listen. Because life isn't just about what we achieve, it's about who we become when the spotlight fades. May we all find the courage to rebuild what truly matters, even if it begins with an apology to ourselves. Thank you for taking the time to walk through this story with us. If it touched something in your heart or reminded you of someone you've once loved or lost, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Every story we tell is a small light, and your support helps us keep shining it further. Stay with us for more stories that heal, connect, and inspire.